All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This will be our final discussion of postmodern fiction and our poetry and nonfiction. With our last selection, we come to a topic we have not actually talked about before in this course, and unfortunately will not be talking about again because there is only one example of it in the Norton Anthology, and I could have provided you with other examples of this type of literature, but I thought we would just mostly stick to the anthology. So we are dealing not only with a work of nonfiction, a memoir, but also a work of comics, which is a different medium than any we've studied before, a different form of art and literature. So comics is a visual medium. It has been defined by the theorists who have sort of tried to differentiate it from other types of art as what has been called sequential art. That is pictures juxtaposed in a spatial sequence. So as opposed to literature, it tells a story or communicates information visually. As opposed to other visual forms, though, it does it by juxtaposing at least two images in space. That's as opposed to, let's say, painting, which is just one image, or film, which runs together multiple images in a time sequence. So comics, and this is only one definition, but this is the most sort of canonical, official definition that has been provided for what this medium is, as opposed to other media of communication, such as the literary or the cinematic or the visual. That is the single image visual. So sequential art. So it's interesting, though, the Norton Anthology, they're quite conscious of the fact that they only have one piece of comics in their book. And so they begin the bio of Art Spiegelman with something I don't think we've ever seen them do before, which is they define his genre. They don't begin, they didn't begin Maxine Hong Kingston's bio with defining the memoir. They didn't begin Louise Glick's bio by defining the poem. They just sort of assume you're coming to these genres having read other works of memoir or poetry or fiction, but you might not have read a comic, or you might not have studied one. You might not have come to college having studied it in high school the way you have with most other literary genres. So they have to sort of tell you the history of this art form before they can tell you about the practitioner, in this case, Art Spiegelman. So so they give a paragraph giving the history of comics. Now, I regularly teach a course, a 15-week course called The History of Comics at the other school where I teach, the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. So you might imagine that I have a lot to say about this, and I do. And their narrative of the history of comics here is a bit... nothing they say is false exactly, but it's not the way I'd tell the story or where I'd place the emphasis. However, it is the way you'd tell the story if you thought that the work of Art Spiegelman was the unquestionable culmination of this art form, which I don't. I like Art Spiegelman. I think Maus is a masterpiece. I think it's a wonderful work, as we'll discuss. But I don't think that all of the history of comics has been leading to this one thing, which is essentially the way they tell the story. So I put the passage on Spiegelman's picture, the way I always put a passage from the bio onto the slide. I'm not going to read it out loud. You can read it yourself. I'm going to give my own take on what they're saying. I'm going to agree with them that there needs to be a little bit of a history of comics before we can look at this excerpt from Maus. Then I'll tell you Spiegelman's biography. Then we'll look at some passages from his work. So, when does comics begin? Well, I mentioned to you that the most kind of official accepted definition of what this medium is sequential art, as theorized by this guy named Scott McCloud, MCCLOUD, if you'd like to pursue that further in his book Understanding Comics from 1993. It's a book that actually postdates Maus. Now, McCloud, having given that extremely broad definition, in his book Understanding Comics, goes on to say, well, if comics is just sequential art, then comics has existed since humanity first was painting on the cave wall. Because if you look at cave art, it seems to be pictures of the hunt in a sequence, and you can find it in Roman friezes and in the tapestries of medieval Europe and in the codices of the Maya Empire. And so throughout the global history of art, you find comics, you find sequential art, which is, fine. we can talk about that. That's an interesting thing to discuss. However, comics in its modern form, the thing you think of when you think of comics, which is panels that contain images that are arranged in a sequence, which usually have some words in them that communicate information or narrative, that goes back to about the end of the 19th century. It's something that had been coalescing in both European and Japanese art. There's three main comics traditions in the world that developed somewhat separately from one another, which are the American, the European, particularly centered on France, and then the Japanese. And so there's these three great comics traditions, which isn't to say that they didn't mutually influence each other at certain points, and it's not to say that there aren't other traditions, but mostly we talk of American comics, Franco-Belgian comics, and Japanese comics. And what's the common denominator, though, of those three places, America, Western Europe, and Japan, at the end of the 19th century, is all three of those places are urbanizing heavily. They are transitioning in big ways from an agrarian to an industrial economy and from a rural to an urban society. And what this is leading to is the consolidation of people in cities, particularly people who had not necessarily had the kinds of formal educations that people had had before. However, they were literate, because more and more people become literate in the industrializing world at the end of the 19th century, because you need a literate population for an industrial economy. So they're literate, but they're not necessarily classically trained in the way that the much more narrowly elite-defined literacy of the previous period had been. So they need reading material. And the reading material, they need information, but they also need entertainment. So you have the development and growth of these mass newspapers in this period at the end of the 19th century. And they have news, or propaganda as the case may be, in the front of them, but they also have an entertainment component. And this is where the comic strip comes in. So the comic strip is born at the end of the 19th century with this work called The Yellow Kid in 1895, that appeared in American newspapers in 1895. Comic strips become very successful over the course of the 20th century, including ones I'm sure you've heard of, whether it's Crazy Cat or Peanuts, which features Charlie Brown and Snoopy, etc. And then they transition. I mean, there's still comic strips to this day, but people, enterprising business people realize, well, why sell it once when you can sell it twice? So they come up with the idea of collecting comic strips into magazine-like pamphlets around the 1930s and selling those. And they do sell those, and that becomes very successful, and that's the birth of the comic book around 1935 or so. And then since that is successful, and I'm just dealing with the American tradition here, it's a different story in Europe and Japan, but that's beyond the scope of our course. So that becomes successful. So they say, well, why don't we do original content instead of just reprinting comic strips? And so they start doing original content, and that's where you have the birth of the genre that really is quite new in the 20th century that has lately taken off in film, which is the superhero. And for most of the 20th century in America, the superhero and comics were very closely associated with one another, because until you have the films that start coming out at the end of the 20th century of Batman and Superman, and then the X-Men and the Marvel films, comics were mainly the place where you'd find superheroes. So superhero comics become quite a lucrative industry that really dominate the comic book industry as opposed to the comic strip industry through the 20th century. Now, something else happens in the middle of the 20th century, right in the 1950s. because superheroes were not the only genre of comic book being published. There were crime comics, horror comics, westerns, romance, science fiction. Every popular genre you can think of were being published in comics form. But what happened was there came to be a moral outcry against comics, a fear after World War II in the late 40s and early 50s that comic books, which were extremely popular among children, were corrupting them with their lurid sex and violence. And it is true if you go back and look at some of the comics of the late 50s and of the late 40s and early 50s. That is, it was pretty rough stuff, especially if you look at the horror comics. They could be very graphic and bloody, and other things, misogynistic, racist, etc. And so there's this, it gets roped into a general concern at this time around juvenile delinquency, which is tied into that 50s conformism and the culture of the outsider and the emerging counterculture that we looked at the beginning of the semester, there's this concern about juvenile delinquency. Right at the time, Allen Ginsberg is saying, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. So comics fall under public censure. The government gets involved. There are congressional hearings into juvenile delinquency in which comics are roped in, and comic book company owners are grilled before Congress. And what they end up doing is the comic book industry self-imposes an extremely restrictive censorship code upon itself in the middle of the 20th century, which was so restrictive. It wasn't just that you couldn't have graphic sex and violence, which maybe you could understand if you're talking about stuff being sold to children, but it was things like you must never show anything that calls authority into question. You must never show anything subversive to the state. And in fact, one of the first comics censored under the Comics Code, which is what it was called, you would have to submit your comic books to the censorship body called the Comics Code Authority. And if they approved of it, they'd put a sticker on it. And if they didn't approve of it, they wouldn't. And you might be thinking, well, who the hell cares? But there was a real consequence here, which is that the places that sold comics wouldn't sell them if they didn't have the sticker. So you were sort of writing yourself out of the market there. So one of the first comics censored under the Comics Code was one that was kind of a science fiction allegory protesting segregation, racial segregation in America. And because that was still the law of the land in the early 50s, before the Civil Rights Movement and before Brown versus Board of Education and other such legal rulings that end legal segregation, well, that was subversive to the state. And so you had that being censored. So comics, mainstream comics, DC and Marvel comics that were publishing superhero comics in the 50s and 60s, they were subject to this code. And so if you wanted to do comics outside of that, you were shut out of the industry. And so this leads in the general ferment and social revolt of the 1960s that we've already talked about in this class to the development of what were called underground comics. Underground comics were self-published comics or small press comics. Generally, they developed on the West Coast, so they're part of that West Coast shift we talked about with the development of the counterculture and the liberation literature of the 60s. Again, San Francisco was the center of this, with an artist named Robert Crumb and the people around him. And these were comics, they were self-published or small press published. Crumb was selling his first works. He was just going up and down the street in San Francisco selling them out of a baby carriage that he had piled high with his own copied books. And they were everything mainstream comics weren't. They weren't about superheroes. They were autobiographical. They were about sex. They were about drugs. They were openly subversive to the government or to any kind of like middle class respectability. Some of that is happening in ways that we would now look back on askance. I mean, Crumb is a controversial figure. He was in some of the ways that writers like Philip Roth and John Updike were, who were writing about sex from this uninhibitedly appetite-driven male point of view, heterosexual male point of view. And so his work has been criticized in some of the same way the major literary male heterosexual writers like Roth and Updike were criticized. But nevertheless, they were defying convention. And that's where the Norton editors writing the bio of Spiegelman think that comics first become a sort of worthwhile form of literature and art, which, let me just say, that's a ridiculous way of telling the story. There's extraordinarily sophisticated things that were happening even in the early 20th century comic strips, not to mention what's happening in France and Japan. So don't take their word for it. I think this way of narrating the story is not at all adequate. But anyway, I've told the story up to the point where Art Spiegelman comes in. So sorry for this incredibly long preamble, but I had to sort of set the table, as it were, for talking about comics. So who is Art Spiegelman? Well, Spiegelman is born in 1948 to a family of Polish Jewish Holocaust survivors, and he's born in Sweden because they were leaving Poland, and that was one of the places they went. But in 1951, they emigrate to New York, and he grows up in Rego Park, Queens, in New York City. And his parents were survivors of the Holocaust. They also had a very difficult marriage, partially as a result of that. His mother kills herself when Spiegelman is in his 20s, and these are events that later inform his graphic memoir. He goes to college, and then after college, he's going to become an artist, and he becomes an artist. I think he works for a trading card company and other sort of commercial art projects, but he sees that the energy in comics is in this underground scene in San Francisco. So he leaves New York, or wherever he went to college. He leaves the East Coast, goes out to San Francisco, meets up with Robert Crumb, and is hanging out in the underground world. And in the 60s and 70s, he does a series of experimental comics that are kind of reflective of his life and his desire, too, to push this new art form of comics, which, whatever you think of the claim that it goes back to the cave wall, is really, in its modern form, much younger than things like memoir or fiction or poetry. So he does a lot of experimental comics, which are worth looking up. And then in the 80s, with his wife, who is a French woman named Françoise Mouly, he starts his own journal of comics that is meant to be a serious literary journal of the kind in which so many of the works we've read for this course were first published, but not for poetry or prose, but rather for comics. And so this is called Raw. And in this new venue, he serializes his own work, which is the story of his father's experiences in the Holocaust. And he tells that story, but he also tells the story of his own telling of the story. So it's not just his father's story, it's his story as he tries to get the story out of his father, who's this very difficult man, a very complicated man, a very lovable man, but also a very a man who does a lot of unforgivable things. In fact, he reminds me a lot of Troy in Fences. I think Mouse and Fences would actually be a very good comparison, despite being very different media, because at the center of both is this man who is in many ways horrible to his family, but is also clearly that way because of the ways in which he was subject to social oppression. And so you have this very complicated ethical question of how to respond to this figure who does so many bad things, but also you see that he did them partially because of the way he was mistreated by his society. And also, there's something lovable about both characters. There's something grand about both characters. There's something larger than life about both characters that you also can't help but respond to. And so one of the things about Mouse that can't be captured in a brief excerpt, you really have to read the whole book, and I very much recommend reading the whole book, it's excellent, is the portrayal of this character, this three-dimensional character. And it's really a landmark in portraying character in the art form of comics, which hasn't really dealt very well over its history with the kind of three-dimensional complex characters that fiction can deal with, or drama, because it seems to, because of its pictorial quality, be more oriented toward like the archetypal or even the caricatural. So that's, I think, Spiegelman's real achievement, is this characterization, this feat of characterization that comics hadn't seen before. And the other thing he does with Maus, and this is what gives it its title, which is simply the word Maus in German, is he uses animals as an allegory for the Holocaust, which is, he's drawing on a tradition of cartooning in the comics world where animals would sort of stand in for different types of people. And so he portrays the Nazis, he portrays the Germans as cats, and he portrays Jews as mice. And then around that, he portrays a series of other caricatures, some of them quite calculated. So the Poles appear as pigs, which is both unclean from the Jewish point of view, not kosher, and then just the general slur against people as pigs. And that was very controversial. When this book was first published in a Polish translation, it was boycotted because the Poles, I don't know who the Poles are, but certain people in Poland thought, from their point of view, we were the victims of the Nazis. We were occupied. But the way Spiegelman's father tells it, and you can actually get this from the excerpt, there was so much anti-Semitism in Poland that the Poles, as he saw it, were complicit in the Holocaust. And Spiegelman is a very forthright and plain-spoken person in certain ways, and he said if the Poles didn't want to be portrayed as pigs, they shouldn't have been anti-Semitic. That's exactly what he said in an interview. So that just shows how this use of animal imagery can be sort of offensive, calculated to offend. And it was calculated to offend. It was calculated to be a provocative gesture of the kind in which comics, and particularly underground comics, specialize. This desire to be underground, to be shocking to mainstream society, and some of the ways we saw that the Beats also were. So Spiegelman makes this provocative gesture of portraying his characters as animals. So that's one thing he wants to do. He wants to sort of poke fun. Ultimately, he's poking fun at Nazi ideology, which says that there are, species of people, and they know what those species are, and they can be in control of that. So he uses this cartooning gesture to mock that idea, to make fun of racism, to call it into question. And that's actually what I want to draw attention to in the two passages from Maus I selected, as you'll see in a moment. Just to finish out Spiegelman's biography, he and his wife, Françoise Mouly, were closely tied to the New Yorker magazine since the 80s, and he also did a graphic novel about 9/11, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, called In the Shadow of No Towers. The other thing to know about Maus is that it was published in 2 volumes, one in 1986 and one in 1992, and the second one became the first work of comics to be given a Pulitzer Prize. So that's just some background on Maus. I want to look at 2 passages. We're only given 1 chapter, and it seems to me to be a somewhat randomly selected chapter. I don't know that this is any more important than any other chapter in the work. He draws in a sort of sketchy, cartoony style meant to evoke the woodblock prints that are a tradition of German art. So I normally teach this book in an art school, and so I normally teach Maus in a context where we've been talking about visual arts for about 12 weeks before we get to it, and I'm usually talking about this to art students who have already taken several art history courses. So I'm not used to giving a kind of basic introduction to Maus. So there's so much I have to say about this book that is just not really relevant to this particular course. I was excited when I saw that it was in the anthology, but now as I'm talking about it, I'm realizing that there's only so much I can tell you about it without having to give you a 12-week course that had led up to it. So I'm not going to say very much about Spiegelman's drawing style because we just haven't talked about the visual arts in this course in a way that would be preparation for that. I'm sorry if you can hear that. There's a truck backing up right outside my window here. Anyway, the thing I want to get into, that there are 2 passages I want to look at that are really about one thing. which is about the ways in which Spiegelman's presentation is informed by postmodernism. Because this is a memoir. This is a story of his life and his father's life. And there was even some controversy when it first came out, and it was reviewed in the New York Times, or it was put on the New York Times bestseller list. And I think the New York Times originally characterized it as fiction. And Spiegelman was very offended by this. And he said, no, this happened. This is nonfiction. I think he even thought there was something akin to denying the Holocaust about calling it fiction. And I think their reasoning was, well, it's a book about cartoon animals. So there's a fictional element to this, unavoidably, in the way that he portrays his characters as animals. And I think his view, I'm sort of interpreting, I'm putting words in his mouth a little, but his view is that telling the story of reality in a way that calls attention to how reality is constructed in words and images makes it even more non-fictional than if he had just told the story in a straight non-fictional way. That his scrupulosity in showing himself hearing the story from his father and having scenes that you don't see in this excerpt, but there are scenes in the book where he reflects on his own process of drawing and writing. And in the second volume, he reflects on the success of the first volume and how guilty it makes him feel, as if he's exploiting the victims of the Holocaust for his own profit. And in the very gesture of using this animal iconography that serves as a mocking exposure of Nazi racialist ideology, all of these postmodern gestures, which are so metafictional and so induce you to think about how reality is only received by you through its mediations in the media, such as visual images and words. In Spiegelman's view, this doesn't make it fiction. This makes it serious nonfiction, the most nonfictional discourse you could have, because it's a work that doesn't just pretend that it can tell you the truth without all of these complications, but in presenting all these complications, it tells you a more complex truth than you would be able to receive otherwise. And I think that makes it one of the most sophisticated works of the era of postmodernism in American literature, and it shows you, I think, how postmodernism cannot just be what it sometimes threatens to seem to be, which is nihilistic gain, but can actually be an aid to writers who want to communicate the most serious kinds of ethical, historical, political, and emotional truth. So I want to look at two passages and draw your attention to some of the complexities. So there's a scene in the excerpt you're given where so the characters' names are Vladek and Anya, I think, is his wife at the time, these are Spiegelman's parents, Vladek and Anya. And there's a scene where they are undercover in Poland. They've escaped from the Germans, and they're undercover in Poland. And the way Spiegelman represents it is that they are wearing pig masks. Now, the incredible irony of this, the incredible way in which this exposes the falsity of racial ideology, is that they're not wearing masks. You can't tell necessarily someone's ethnicity or religion by looking at them. You just can't. That's not necessarily a reliable guide, especially in the European context where, so in the American context, skin color is seen as the marking of race, primarily. But in Europe, where there's this division between Jewish and Gentile, that's not necessarily a visual marker that you can tell by looking at someone. And so they're wearing these pig masks, but of course in reality they weren't wearing masks. They're just walking around. And they're trying to fit in by speaking German and other things that would not betray themselves by a sense of cultural practice. But Spiegelman's use of the mask is his ironic commentary on the falsity here. And then there's this remarkable moment in this passage I've picked out where Vladek is afraid that someone behind him is a Pole who has figured out that he is Jewish. And when you first see this guy, you see him from the front and you see that he has a pig face. And then look at that middle panel in the bottom row. Then the minute he reveals that he is Jewish, the back of his head comes into view and you see that he's wearing a mask too. And so Spiegelman goes from not being able to tell that the pig face is a mask to being able to tell that it's a mask once you know his true ethno-religious identity. But this just shows the incredible arbitrariness of that. And so some critics have accused this book of going with racial stereotypes by using the animal imagery. I think that's exactly wrong. I think the animal imagery is Spiegelman's means of exposing this ideology for the fraud that it is. And another remarkable moment is the moment where Vladek and Anya see a rat. And if you read interviews with Spiegelman, he talks about this scene as a kind of crisis for him when he was doing the book, because he interviewed his father and he recorded and then transcribed the interviews and then used those as the basis for this book. And he was going to put this scene in and he thought, I'm drawing these characters as mice and he's telling me they saw a rat. If I show these mice afraid of a rat, doesn't that screw up the whole metaphor? And he said, I decided just to go with it because the point of the metaphor is the falsity of the ideology that informs it. So why not just further expose its absurdity by having these mice characters exposed to this rat? And you see, though, he uses a different drawing style. So the mice are drawn in this sort of cartoonish style and the rat is drawn in a far more realistic style. But in any case, the juxtaposition and there's a lot to say about how the rat and the barrel seem to be in front of the panels, but I won't bore you with that. My art students get really into that. We talk for a long time about things like that because most of the students I teach at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design are majors in the field of comics, and they want to go on to become comics artists. So with them, we talk for a very long time about these minutiae of the technical choices that he's made. But that's beyond the scope of this course. But it is interesting, if you're interested in comics, that the way he puts the rat and the barrel spatially in front of the panels as if they're coming up off the page is very interesting. But anyway, that's not something we can talk about. So he confronts the mice with the rat to further, in a further meta gesture. So just to conclude sort of where I began talking about Maus, I think the importance of it is that it shows how postmodern techniques can be used to enhance the idea that in a work of literature, in a work of art, you can tell the truth. It's not just something that undercuts that you have to incorporate. This is what makes it postmodern. You incorporate all of the insights that postmodernism has had into your work to make it an even more effective, more complex, more nuanced, and more powerful vehicle for telling the truth you want to communicate. And so that ends our discussion of Maus, and that ends our discussion of what I'm calling postmodern nonfiction. Thanks very much and have a great day.